Chapter 2. Machiko, warrior, looked around and found herself surrounded by death. The bugs. For a brief moment, fear exploded inside her. Then she realized that fear was her friend. It helped lime the borders between life and death, light and dark. It plumbed the depths of her soul and biochemistry, bringing up the thunder of valor and the controlled explosion of adrenaline. Up ahead, Topknot, running point, aimed a strafe of plasma. The fiery stuff raked across a line of the aliens, cracking their chitin into cinders. Lethal acid splashed back, boiling into acrid steam. Others of the pack added to the fire, tearing a wide hole in the jumble of the bugs, the swelling ranks pouring forth through the tunnels to protect their hive. The pack had just landed on this planet, in the majestic and silvery craft that was their starship. Their mission was simple: secure this hive's queen for their own purposes. Simple though their goal might be, the road there was not. She was working with a pack of Yautja on perhaps one of their most dangerous objectives. Indeed, so dangerous that the predator hunter's normal codes of conduct in this pursuit went right out the window. For this expedition, anyway, the ritual laws of matching the quarry weapon for weapon were suspended. The naginatas and scatterguns prescribed for hunting the Kinda Amida, the hard meat, were replaced by plasma casters and lasers. This was no hunting trip. This was war. Just as it had generally been in the history of her own Uman peoples, there are no rules in war, only objectives. Machiko, warrior, was no longer Machiko Noguchi, no longer a streamlined ramrod for the corporation on a planet of alien cattle. She was Datudi, proud and brave warrior, who had proved herself on the planet called Ryushi, and was blooded by no less than the great Dashunde, a great predator leader. Datudi, little knife. The lightning scar that he had etched on her forehead just before his death with the acid of a broken bug finger, partly neutralized by his bloody spittle, marked her glory for life. When the pack searching for Dashunde and his ill-fated mission, headed by the valiant Vakalita, had discovered Machiko, she was Datudi, and she bore Dashunde's mark, and had a queen's skull hanging above the door of her home. She had been one of the surviving humans, on Ryushi. She had no particular reason to stay, seeing she no longer felt committed to the company, and every reason to go with the Yautja. With the alien hunters she found the core of honor, a state that eradicated the shame that had descended upon her family when her father, having been caught embezzling funds from his family, had committed a bloody seppuku, but a suicide without honor. Though she had excelled scholastically, and then corporately, this was a pain and shame that had always hung over her, crippling her relations with other people. She had found it difficult to get close to people, but there was always the desire. Now there was no reason to get close to the Yautja. Here, thus released, she could test herself, test her courage and skills, test all the things that would lead her into the state of grace shown her by Dashunde. As a blooded one, she'd been entitled to come for hunts. She felt a real and profound need for that now, a vital desire to pursue honor and valor and the ways of the Yautja, a desire she needed to explore. And so now, here she was. They moved through the birthing chambers, remains of ill-fated denizens of this foggy world, ape-like creatures with 4 arms, big jaws and elephantine ears, hung from the walls, their chests burst, their innards in various states of decomposition. The smell was beyond description, beyond bad, cloying and gagging. If not for the filters in the mask they'd given her, Machiko would not have been able to make it through that funk. Well, perhaps. After all, she was no longer Machiko. She was Datudi, and she had not yet fully tested what Datudi could take. Whatever it was, she knew it was going to have to be a lot. She'd braced herself for this raid. She'd braced herself when she'd gone off with a pack. Her whole life now was just one big brace. Payoff time now. The big guns having paused momentarily for their metaphorical breaths, the leaders stepped aside, staggered English line style, for their backers to let loose their volleys. Machiko and the youngers to the rear discharged their weapons, cutting into the throng of aliens, slicing, dicing, and generally churning up the hard meat into chunky-style puree, acid flavour. Machiko wore the Yautja armour, sleek and economical, and oddly comfortable. The material worked well in the movements of her lithe muscles, and the air circulation was superb. The armour was blessed, and it felt almost like augmenting prosthetics, as though the lines converged into power that boosted her own. Her hair was worn now in the ceremonial ringlets, rather like neat dreadlocks bouncing energetically at the back of her head as she moved forward, her discharges blasting through the dying, spindly creatures. They broke through. As though this knowledge was as instinctual as it was empirical, the pack moved as one through the opening presented to it. The wedge of the older, valor-hogging frontmost went first, and the others, including Machiko, allowed this. All were equal in honour, all were esteemed. However, Machiko had quickly gloomed in on the fact that these predators were pretty much like an earthly predator pack. The members jostled for dominance, and the older, smarter, and more experienced members were generally either given deference or simply ploughed past the more awkward younger members. "Ha ha ha!" whooped one of the younger warriors, a snot-nosed kid about a head shorter than the others. A difference in height was almost made up for by the chip on his shoulder. This dude had bridled at Machiko's presence in the pack from the word go, and had been on her back ever since. He took guff from the others for his lack of stature, then handed it to her, coated with a little shit for good measure. "Ha ha ha!" It was garbled laughter. He'd heard Machiko laugh once, and he would imitate her from time to time, out of spite. She jostled right back generally, jostled just short of a set too. No reason to make unnecessary waves, when all she wanted was to sing in the band. No, especially right now, smack in the middle of a den of the most vicious killers in the galaxy. Ha ha ha! The tide had let up under the slash and burn of their weapons. The elders were hurrying along, intent on their goal. The other youngers tagged along, just behind them. She called her tormentor Shorty, though before she'd assumed he didn't know any English. Now, though, she wondered. He turned around and shoved her. Ha ha ha! She went back a few feet, surprised at the push. She'd already figured out that the very last man had the least honourable position in battle, albeit a necessary one. That must have been what Shorty intended, to make sure she came right up in the rear. "All right," she said, "let's just go," hoping her tone was understandable, if not her words. Ha ha ha! Shorty fairly skipped ahead, waggling his locks at her in a defiant, teasing manner. Oops. She saw the thing way before he did. It was coming out of a tubing in the ceiling, a mean-looking bastard, its diseased banana head already dripping saliva, its claws outstretched and ready to jump. "Watch out!" she cried, pulling up her plasma gun. Shorty may have been young and stupid, but he was quick. He spun around, looking up immediately at the trouble. She waited. Not because she wanted to see Shorty killed. Worse. She wanted to let him sweat a moment, until she did something much more worse. Fast as he was, the bug was faster. It jumped down, leaping for the certain kill. Machiko fired. The blast caught the bug in the midsection exactly at the point she had calculated, not only smashing the thing to fiery bits, but blowing back those pieces in their acid blood against the wall, preventing them from falling on Shorty. Shorty stepped back away from the devastation. He had stopped laughing. Through his mask, Machiko could see the ice of his glare. Ha ha ha! One of the other younglings up ahead had stopped, a brawny arm pointing an accusing finger. Ha ha ha! They'd learned the laugh all right, and now the derision was being heaped on Shorty. A bark of communication. Shorty turned and stormed off. Machiko followed into the harsh acridity of the smoking advance. Time to get back to work. Sometimes, at lulls like these, when Machiko felt a little sick to her stomach, more than ill at ease with her companions, she wondered about how the bugs had spread across the galaxy. Simultaneous evolution? From what she could gather, hunter folklore seemed to indicate that. But could that folklore have been created to mask a troublesome possibility? Could the bugs have spread because of the predator's blooding rights? Could accidents have occurred on many other worlds? Accidents of containment, like that which had occurred on Ryushi. Of course, the cultural pride of these predators could never stomach that notion, and so the possibility was washed over with insistent folklore. Besides, who could really say? The bugs had a way of spreading, like disease, and interstellar vector theory really had no bearing on what they were doing now, on this planet. The bugs had this planet. That was all that mattered. The Hunter mission now was not to dispute the bug domain, but to appropriate their queen, for their own purposes. And their destination was not far away. Machiko could sense that much. Breakthrough was imminent. The elders, honor and glory and ego etched in flesh and bone and armor, blasted their way through one last tissue of defense. By the blaze of their weapons, Machiko could see a much larger chamber, lit in a feral spectral glow. Closer, she could see that it was like a chamber of the devil's heart, and squatting inside that chamber was its own particular demon. The queen was about normal size, which was to say, big. It hunkered in its hold like a cornered Jabberwocky, its fingernails on blackboard hiss already aroused by the surrounding hunters. As rearguard, it was the younger's duty now to keep the queen's drones away while the more experienced hunters did their jobs. Machiko performed that duty, but made sure she didn't turn her back on Shorty. These creatures were supposedly made of honor, but she'd never really trusted young males of any race, and now was not the time to begin. The predators knew their prey well. One of the bugs' collective strengths lay in their complete subjection to their queen. Another was their total dedication to the proliferation of their species. But within these strengths was the key to their one major weakness. The warrior drones would do nothing to endanger the life of their queen. In turn, she would do nothing to endanger the lives of her unborn brood. Armed with that knowledge, the success of the hunters was assured. Still, it wouldn't be easy. Trouble along the way was virtually guaranteed, despite the strutting self-confidence this pack had displayed toward the effort from the very beginning. As the youngest picked off any of the drones who dared to poke their misshapen, horrific heads into the chamber, the elders expertly shot off their grappling devices around the numerous limbs of the queen, around her neck, effectively hog-tying her. The mighty weave of the cords pulled tight. The queen raged and heaved, but her powerful huge body was held in vague check. Even though she wobbled, she surged from time to time, and it would have to do. The queen thus reasonably subdued, the drones seemed to check themselves, keyed intuitively to her vulnerability. Now came the most dangerous part. The capture team had to maintain control of the queen as Topknot, their brawny leader, prepared her for travel. This was a ticklish business, as it consisted of separating her from her egg sac. Topknot advanced, his long, sharp blade held high and glistening in the halogen portable lamps carried by the others. He raised it high, tensed himself, aimed, and brought it down like a surgically trained executioner upon the fleshy, interstitial connective tissue. The blade cut down and through the stuff hard. There was a shriek from the queen. Unfortunately, the hunter whom Machiko called Three-Spot was caught napping. His stance had been improper, and so when the queen unexpectedly threw all her ample strength into that limb and pulled it away, he was lifted bodily into the air by the rope curled around his arm. The queen hurled him around like a yo-yo and dashed him down onto the hard ground. Stunned, the hunter could not move, but the queen could. With a vicious vengeance, she brought down her own scythe-like claws directly onto Three-Spot's chest. So sharp were the claws, so much momentum did the queen have in her blow, that they drove down directly through that armour, burying deep into the warrior's chest, with a sickening splash and thunk of released blood. Three-Spot wriggled and spasmed for a moment, then he was dead. That's what tended to happen in these situations. On their way out of the unfortunate hunter's body, the razor claws slashed through the rope. Part of the queen was free. This wasn't good. The situation was pretty obvious to Machiko. The capture party's continued safety rested on their ability to control the queen. Her freedom would be the signal for her brood to attack. Back when she was a corporate ramrod on the planet Ryushi, Machiko would have examined the situation, weighed her options. People would have died. Now, instead, she simply acted. Dropping her gun, she leapt for the loose rein. She had a split-second grab for it before the thing whipped back out of reach. Her leap was automatic, but there seemed to be magic in it, talent in it, a skill and precision that she hadn't owned before her experience on Ryushi. She'd leaped out of her position, darted past the others, still seemingly frozen in the confusion of the moment. Her fingers folded around the rope, grabbed it, held it just long enough for the other mesh glove to grab it, wind it around her hand. When the thing went tight, it felt almost as though her arms were being pulled out of their sockets. Fortunately, she dug in and was pushing down with all her power. "Just hold it, Datudi," she told herself. Little Knife, the name that Dashunde had given her. Her handle on strength and pride and honor. Just keep that thing in control. The others will do the rest. Mere moments seemed to stretch as long as her arms wanted to. Sinews creaked and her bones felt close to cracking. The feral alien smell of the place threatened to overwhelm her. However, she concentrated on stillness. She would not be moved. She pretended she was sitting zazen, totally censored, totally within herself, and lashed her mind to this planet's gravity. She sensed more than felt the others gaining control, and then 2 hunters took her place. She stepped back, breathing hard. The Queen was still straining at the ropes, but she was in control again. By stepping in like that, she prevented a possible disaster. Topknot approached her. She expected, what, a pat on the back? A bend of the mandibles by way of smile? Some kind of medal of honor? No, she didn't expect that at all. Not from this race of beings. And she braced herself. Topknot slammed his arm against her chest with such power that she was knocked down. Despite her preparation, her breath was knocked from her lungs. She did not offer resistance. She did not take offense. She did not complain. What she'd done, besides saving these hunters, was to go against her station in stepping out to grab that rope. By abandoning her post, she had disobeyed Topknot's orders. Though she helped avert disaster, she had revealed herself as untrustworthy. Her insubordination might be forgiven, but it would never be forgotten. These crab faces might not have been around to forget without that insubordination, but she'd still flown in the face of tradition, honor, and authority. Oh well. They started to haul the Queen back to the ship. She picked herself off the ground and simply stood for a moment, waiting for the chamber to stop spinning around her. Eventually, on their way out, Topknot turned his attention to her. He gestured forward, and she understood. She was to take position at the advance guard. She picked up her gun and hobbled ahead. It was a token position at best. The Queen's pheromones would do the work of scattering her brood before her. It was rather like pulling out a hostage with a great big sharp machete held to her throat. The older, more experienced members of the troop, the ones with the necessary muscle and alien wrangling experience, hauled the reluctant Queen forward toward the ship. As much as Broken Tusk, Dashunde's mark, allowed her entrance into this society, her behaviour that day had branded her as an outsider. She still had much to learn about the ways of the hunters, but nonetheless, she knew that she had her choice over again, she would have done the same thing. The haul back seemed to take forever, what with the bitch digging in from time to time and needing a quick stun to take some of the fight out of her. And what a job they had ahead of them to boot. According to Topknot's briefing, bringing a captive alien queen onto a ship was the most dangerous part of any capture mission. When they got to their destination, Machiko soon found out why. The ramp was lowered by remote control. It was narrow and posed quite a problem. She could see that the tight confines of the ship would allow no margin for error, no room for slack. According to Topknot, many times the captive queen made a suicidal last-ditch attempt at the door of the nesting chamber. With great effort, the hunters hauled the Queen up the corrugated ramp. They pulled her through into the area that would be her prison, a chamber separated from the rest of the ship. Machiko took up her position by the end of the ramp. She could not help but cast concerned glances back at the progress the others were making, getting that monster into her own private suite. She expected it to make that last break for freedom at any moment. What she did not expect, what came as a surprise, was that the bid for freedom came not from her, but from her children. Somehow she got off an unseen signal or a silent call that spurred her offspring into action. They came roaring out of the cavern. More fiendish than ever, their cries spurred Machiko into action. She swiveled around, took stock, reacted instantly, swinging her weapon around and spraying streams of bright death into the burgeoning hordes. In conjunction with her fellow youngsters, They may have killed 30 of the bugs in the next 15 seconds. The aliens just kept on coming. Top Knot bawled out a retreat order, a bawl that turned into a howl of consternation. Machiko had already started up the corrugated ramp. The bugs seemed to pay no attention to the fact they were being slain by the score. A few broke through the fiery onslaught and started up the ramp as well. Machiko turned around to see what the commotion was and was horrified to see that the ranks of brave, valiant senior hunters were splintering. The queen had turned into a raving fury, trailing lines. She leaped to one side. Another cry. In the confusion, Machiko realized that Top Knot had called out for the ramp to be lifted, and not a second too soon. Even as the lip of the thing yanked from the ground, 2 bugs clambered on board. Fire from the retreating hunters tore them off, but 2 more took their place. Meanwhile, the ranks of the hunters frantically fought for control. Machiko stood aside to allow the last of the youngers to climb on board. She fired one last salvo, tearing the final bug off the edge and hurling it back into the frenzied roil of its companions. And then, with a chuffing sound and the shriek of hydraulics, the ramp door shut. The bastards were outside. The bitch was inside, though, and free. Machiko turned. The hunters were scuttling about to the exits and their posts, while the queen howled out her frustration and anguish. The queen had only one path open to her, directly into the waiting nesting chamber. Behind her was a grillwork-covered vent from which a cable dangled, but it was too small for her to fit through. The others knew this ship much better than Machiko, and they had hurried off to be out of danger. In her confusion and consternation, Machiko had simply stood her ground, watching the queen rampage. The queen turned and headed straight for Machiko. Automatic response drew her gun up as the queen approached at full bore. In fact, the gun seemed to move of its own accord, expertly swinging into place, aiming directly at the queen's head. At this close range, one blast would tear even that huge head off. Just a pull of the trigger would do it. Her finger tightened, but then she stopped herself. No. Too many of her companions had paid with their lives that day trying to reach the queen. To kill it now would negate their sacrifices. In this situation, even honor offered only one course of action: retreat. She dropped the gun and ran. Her breath came in ragged gasps, echoing inside her helmet, her heart drumming a machine gun beat in her chest. Her feet pounded a counter rhythm on the steel floor of the nesting chamber. She barely heard any of it. All she was aware of was the sound of the queen's pursuit, and the implicit sound of her own mortality. Leaving Ryushi and joining the hunters had seemed like the logical thing to do at the time. The right thing to do. The Yautja code, as she perceived it, seemed enviable, clean. As she had waited alone on Ryushi, she had waited for just such an opportunity, feeling herself changed in the crucible of her experiences at Prosperity Wells. Now the decision just seemed stupid and vain, a romantic fantasy. Hard to think of anything but fear and survival when there were tons of drooling death bearing down upon her. Whatever had made her think that she could match the ways of these half-savages? What had she hoped to prove to herself? She ran for her life. It seemed as though she could feel the heat of the creature's breath on her neck. She certainly heard the clank and clank of its chitin, the stretch of its tendons. Up ahead was the door, the passageway to safety. It was round and small and could close quickly. Standing on the other side, hand up and off to the side, was an unexpected figure at the controls. Shorty. She could not see his expression because of his mask. Hell, she didn't know if these things had expressions. She just couldn't read mandible positioning. Shorty's arm twisted. A chack of controls. The door slammed down hard, cutting off her exit. In its very middle was a triangular window. 2 of the hunters, neither of them Shorty, moved up to that window and gazed into the chamber. Neither of them moved a muscle to get the door up. Neither of them made an effort to save her. They just stared at her, spectators of some deadly morality play. Whatever had made her think that she could live by these creatures' bizarre laws, much less gain their respect? She spun around. The monster queen was not as close as she feared, but neither was she far. And she was gaining all the time. Well, she'd worry about saving face after she saved her own skin. She feinted in one direction, and the queen quickly responded, shifting its weight in a twinkling and investing its momentum in its bid to make quick work of this available tormentor. Then Machiko shifted, dodged, and sprinted for her true objective. There was more than one way out of any trap. She headed for the vent and the restraining cable she had noted before. Machiko leaped with all her strength and began to scramble up this rough ladder. She made the climb in record time, but even as she made the grill, she heard the beast below her. It apparently wasn't going to just sit around and watch her get out. She didn't waste a moment. Perched upon her shoulder was a laser. She fired it, and its brilliant beam cut through the wires speedily. She turned it off and pried open the grillwork, making a hole wide enough for her slender body to slip through. Just about it. A moment or two and she'd be out. Even as she was tasting her safety, she felt an awful tug on her hair. The Queen had reached up and grabbed her dreadlocks. Fortunately, the Queen wasn't the only one with sharp and nasty claws. Machiko let go of one of her grips and twisted her wrist forward in a manner that triggered her retractable blades. With almost the same movement, she slashed backward. She cut off her dreadlocks. She also severed most of the Queen's hand. It shrieked. She could feel it thump back onto the floor noisily and messily, the wound spilling acid. None of it, fortunately, over Machiko. Machiko pulled herself up through the hole she'd made in the grating, her muscles performing the function smoothly and efficiently. She once more was grateful for her training, her workouts, her endurance, and her luck. She wiggled through quickly, not giving that bitch down there any time to renew her attack. It was wailing pretty fiercely, and she could smell the acridity of its pumping blood wafting up through the opening. She did not pause to make sure it was okay, but scuttled through the pipes as quickly as she could. There was still the possibility, after all, that it would thrust its good claw through the opening and grab her foot. Her dreadlocks were expendable. She wasn't exactly trying to attract male attention among the hunters. Hell, maybe they even had some glue on she could use. Her foot, though, her foot was a different matter. She needed her foot. Too bad about the Queen's fingers, but the hunters would be able to get control of the thing, and it would certainly still be quite able to do what they needed it to do, namely, lay the eggs they needed for their blooding exercises. Negotiating her way through the air venting was a matter of relying on her intuition and sense of direction. Over, up, down. Eventually she came to another grate. She put her back against the wall, brought her legs up, kicked again. The grate banged out of its fixture, fell back onto the floor. She slipped out lithely and fell the few feet onto the metal deck, landing on the floor on all fours, sleek and ready as a cat. The hunters were standing there, watching her, just standing there in an expectant repose. She tore off her helmet and took in a deep breath. She gave the ritual greeting of a warrior's victory. She wasn't sure what she expected. A thank you? As far as she knew, there was no such phrase in the hunter vocabulary. She'd saved their bacon, and they had nothing to say. They just looked at her, as though trying to perceive what this strange outsider that the shun they had blooded was composed of. This honoured companion they could never understand. Then they did something remarkable. They bowed. She'd bowed for them before, something from her Japanese ancestry she'd shown them. They just stared at that, seemingly uncomprehending. And now they were bowing. All but one. The others turned and left to be about the business of taking off from this planet, of dealing with the captive Queen. All but one. The one lingered. He took his helmet off, and his eyes were like lit coals in the darkness. Shorty. His mandibles danced menacingly. He took a step forward, quick and menacing. Machiko stood her ground. Just inches short of her, the young hunter stopped. Machiko did not move. She did not blink. She just stared directly back at her challenger. The mandibles bristled. But then the hunter spun, stalked away. His steps echoed in the hallway. She'd stared him down. Shorty dared not challenge her now, dared not hurt her after the incredible display of valour, after she'd risked her life to ensure the success of this operation. No, she wasn't one of them, but they owed her more than ever now. She felt the bliss of an endorphin rush, wings of lightning.